I'm Jennifer Matoski. I'm a senior at Boise State University, a later in life student, and deeply grateful to be honored to present the research I did, partially during a senior seminar class, and finally during an independent study where I expanded and developed some new insights in my research. The research is on the correlations of a relationship with God and personal well-being as compared with just connection to a religion or belief system, spiritual path. I find that postmodern Americans are immersed in a burgeoning trend of beliefs about beliefs. The idea that all types of spirituality, spiritual paths, religious systems, etc. are equally beneficial is very pervasive. This belief, of course, is supported by many influencers, one of the favorites being Oprah Winfrey, who states often on her show that any path to God is equally beneficial. Any spiritual path that you choose will be a blessing to your life. And this is a very comforting belief. However, a lot of research has revealed that a personal connection to God or to the divine has more protective benefits on one's life, especially in the areas of well-being, than just association with a belief system or a religious group of some kind. I would love to discuss my review of literature with you. However, I'm here to more discuss my research. However, I'd like to share one of these studies that I found quite interesting. Dr. Mary Olszewski, in a 1994 study of 94 adolescents who frequented church youth groups and had that beneficial experience of association, affiliation, and positive peer support. She found that contrary to her predictions, the youth that were connected to the church but didn't have a strong sense of connection to God didn't develop the coping skills, and found that that connection for them, for these 95 young people, it did not moderate anxiety and depression in her study. According to Olszewski, adolescents who feel, quote, loved and cared for by a personal God did experience these protective benefits. They felt secure, good about themselves, and they were less likely to feel anxious and depressed. Personally, I found that true. On my own adventurous journey to a relationship with a personal God, I have explored many, many spiritual paths. Siddha yogism, Buddhism, sort of a smorgasbord approach to spirituality, a New Age where you kind of pick and choose what appeals to you. None of these really connected to me to a sense of divine until I personally landed on Christianity and found a personal creator God who I could have a friendship with and a relationship with. Now, I'd like to explain a little bit about the terminology I use. I will use the term God to express the divine in the vernacular simply because that's kind of universally understood and accepted. I did tell my study participants that however they called God, he, she, energy, creator, energy, spirit, was perfectly fine, and just understood that the term God was universally used to simplify the language of the study. I'd also like to inform you that contrary to my hopes and expectations, the vast majority of my participants were Christians. I was hoping for more diversity in other religious belief systems, but the Boise State student body is 81% from Idaho, and Idaho is very highly Christian, Catholic, and Mormon, so we had a lot of Christians, a lot of people that consider themselves Christians participating in the study. I was very lucky to get a few pagans, Wiccans, and Muslims, so I was very heartened to have a little diversity. For my second study, and I'll talk more about the demographics a little bit later, I drew from my own personal base, and I got a tiny bit more diversity. However, ironically, although my personal contact base is quite diverse, the Christian friends were the ones who came through and took the time to take the 60-question survey. To them, I'm very grateful, but it, again, slanted my results. So they are highly Christianized vernacular and study participants as well. Now, the research questions that I considered to really overview well-being, I considered how satisfaction in life is affected by a personal relationship with God versus general religiosity. I also looked at how self-concept, self-esteem, how you feel about yourself is affected by a personal relationship with God versus religiosity, and applied the same parameters to coping with stress, which is a little trickier and more nuanced. There's a lot of stress measurements that we've already heard discussed. It was very fascinating, as Joss mentioned earlier, some of the biological factors that are very difficult for an undergraduate, a non-science major, to test. But was very interested to look at how these three things compared for those who are highly religious versus those who ranged on the religiosity scale but had a very strong sense of connection to a loving personal God. The theoretical framework that I applied was primarily John Bowlby's attachment theory. with a real keen focus on Kirkpatrick's ideas about how we attach to God and our concept of the divine. Kirkpatrick brings out two different ideas for how we model, based on our human relationships, our attachment to God. The first of which is God as mother. You know, infants bond to mother. It's their primary human relationship, their first bonding experience in several ways. We follow mom around the house seeking her attention, and when we're in a stress situation, we hope mommy's going to come and pick us up and dust us off. It's very much like a lot of us experience the divine as a mother energy, a nurturing energy, someone we can turn to in times of distress, look to for guidance and companionship. Kirkpatrick also compares the relationship we experience with God as to a romantic partner, where you share joys, you share experience. I personally prefer the idea, the mother analogy, simply because my concept as God is much less a peer and more a higher, brilliant, loving, all-knowing being that has a much bigger brain than I do. So I can always turn to my divine for guidance and nurturance. One of the scriptural texts I found very interesting, as God as mother, is throughout Scripture. We use the he gendered, because that was the Hebrew perspective for those who wrote the Bible. However, so many scriptures say the God is a mother figure to nurture, protect, and care for. Can a mother forget her nursing child? They may, but I, God, will never forget you. Now, the method was a very detailed, very lengthy survey. There were 5 sections, 5 Likert scale response items. As I mentioned, the 2 studies, the first group was 208 BSU students, not very ethnically and age diverse, unfortunately, mostly tradition students, predominantly white, 19 to 25, and Christian, Catholic, Mormon, and agnostic, which we'll talk about the religious groups a little bit later. Very strange, very fascinating growing trend, at least among that age group, and I think perhaps nationwide, of agnosticism, with an ambivalent and questioning approach to belief systems versus having a concrete identifier. The second group was, as I mentioned, the group of my personal friends and contacts, and they were 103. I had to knock off a couple for incomplete surveys, so my total ended up being 333 total participants. The first 3 response items dealt with scales, and I used scales that were time-tested study instruments, Rosenberg's measurement of self-esteem to look at self-concept, and the Beck anxiety inventory to measure the coping and the stress. The Scheer revised life orientation test that gave me data to apply to life satisfaction, as well as Diner's life satisfaction scale. Finally, the last section of the survey, which was presented separately from the first 3 question sections, were the ones regarding connection to God and connection to your spiritual path. I used the Beck and McDonald's attachment to God inventory. Had wonderful questions, things such as, do you perceive God as a loving being? Do you find your connection to God adding value and meaning to your life? And finally, the religious orientation scale revised by Gorsuch and McPherson. The religious orientation scale initially was this very large, unwielding study instrument, and they narrowed it down and changed the vernacular to be a little more modern and accessible to people that are taking it in their current era. And you'll pardon me, my voice is a little off today. The results I graphed very simplistically. However, I tried to do it in such a way as you could see where the changes were. And even though the variance is quite slight, we see the range is only 22 to 30, I found interesting that for the religious, the highly religious group, or the number 4s, down to the number 1s, which are the atheists and some agnostics, the people that really have no sense of strong connection to a religious or spiritual path, it didn't seem that that religiosity had any impact at the higher levels. It dropped a little bit for the ones that were slightly less religious, but overall, just a 2-point range, and mostly 28s, really led me to believe that life satisfaction in this particular study wasn't highly impacted by a connection to a spiritual path or religious group. However, for those that consider themselves extremely close to God, the self-ranking, I'm very close to God, the strongly agree, had a substantially higher score than the ones that were, I'm somewhat close to God. And I found that drop quite interesting, a drop of 8 points. And then it bumped up slightly for those that weren't terribly close to God, and dropped again for those who really had no sense of God. One of the outliers that I found interesting, it wasn't something I expected at all, was that in this study, and it's impossible to chart them since it's not broken down by religious belief system or lack thereof, such as atheists versus deists and theists, I found that the atheists, when I did a religious and blow-by-blow comparison, were much happier than people that were fairly religious but didn't have a connection to God. I'm not able to present, I don't have the cross-sectional regression sort of data that shows you every single outbreak and correlate, but it appears that the atheists were much more satisfied with their life than those who were traditionally called pew warmers, or as I like to call them, cosmetic Christians. People who are there for cultural reasons, for reasons of affiliation, association, image, but don't have that connection to the divine, that strong sense of, I know the God guy and he's my friend. Secondarily, a closer to God relationship correlates to more positive self-concept. You see a flat line straight across for the very highly religious to the not religious at all. I was expecting at least a blip. But for this study of 333 participants, it seemed that their religiosity really didn't have any protective benefits on their self-concept, self-esteem, and self-regard. However, for those who consider themselves quite close to God, substantively higher than those who are moderately close to God in the second group. And the last two groups, again, and those are the agnostics and the atheists right there at the end, it bumped up slightly. I would conjecture that this is something to do with cognitive dissonance. For those who know God, believe in a divine being, and yet that relationship lacks the development, perhaps the intimacy that they know it could, perhaps they feel a slight sense of disappointment, maybe guilt, maybe even not feeling quite good about themselves because they know there is a divine to connect with and they aren't as connected as they'd like to be. So that's my presumption for that group that drops down, way down from 14 to 8 points is quite a substantive change. And I used a different chart for this one because there was so much correlation of the very religious to the close to God groups. As you can see on the left-hand side of the chart, they're quite similar as far as the protective benefits for decreased difficulty in coping with stress. For increased difficulty, it is left to right. The difficulty coping with stress for this chart increases as we go from left to right. Those who were quite religious or had a strong connection to God or their sense of divine were much, much lower than those who were not at all religious or had no connection to God. However, I did see a break right in the number threes, number twos as these would be, the ones that were barely religious and not terribly connected to God, just a slight sense of connection to a divine presence, started to diverge. And what I found interesting was those who said they were not at all close to God really spiked in their difficulty coping with stress. We have an increase from the ones that were at, 21.8, who are very close to God, spiking all the way up to 34.4, which is the high mark on the scale. That bears further investigation. I'd like to learn more about why that is and how that affects people's ability to cope with stress. There's so many factors and so many variables. It would take quite an in-depth study to really unpack that. But it didn't seem for those who had deep religious convictions to those who were not at all religious, there wasn't quite as marked of a change. Now, I did break down my religions just for interesting information. As you can see, my percentages, the numbers haven't been updated. I was having some slide issues, but those are my percentages. And I presented not only the connection to beliefs, relationship with God, satisfied with life, healthy self-concept, but I combined the life satisfaction scores with the self-concept scores because to me that really connotes well-being. There was no way because the stress factors were inverted in their scoring as far as the coping with stress. And I found very interesting that the Jewish participants had an incredibly good self-image and satisfaction with life, followed very closely and equally by Christians, Catholics, and Mormons, all at 21. And the stress factor increased as we go down the chart. For the Shintos, not enough participants to really make a strong correlation, but the agnostics really did drop significantly, especially in the area of self-concept compared with the Jewish. Down to agnostic, there's an 8-point drop. And just very slight changes, but the coping with stress scale is only 10 points in variance. So you had increases as you move down the chart from the people with the highest self-concept and life satisfaction, also the lowest stress scores, all the way down to the bottom, where the Muslims seem to have a pretty hard time coping with stress. I imagine they may have some cognitive dissonance with their belief systems and what some factions of their fellow believers, believe, because there's a lot of variance, as far as I understand, in my friends that share the Muslim faith, as to how it is presented in daily life, especially living in this country. Probably a lot of stress there. And at the very bottom, the lowest self-concept scores of all were the Wiccan participants with a -2. I didn't see any numbers like that for any other members of the group, so that was fascinating. One of the things I mentioned earlier, and I did some looking at the research that's out there, a very recent study by the Pew Research Center revealed that in the last 5 years alone, the religiously unaffiliated, typically calling themselves agnostics, have increased from just over 15% to just under 20% for U.S. adults. That's almost 1% a year. We have a real burgeoning tide of agnosticism. And I found that not only in the university participants, who are the traditional student undergrads, ages 19 to 25 predominantly, but even in my adult friends who range from 20s to up to 80s, that agnosticism, that uncertainty, and that's something that would bear further investigation. But I think perhaps that has something to do with this cultural pervasive belief that all paths are equally beneficial, so the lines are blurred, there's less clear definitions, and there's less of a focus on the divine and more of a focus as a postmodern American on what's right for me. And therefore, there's so much vagueness and uncertainty, it's hard to know what to believe. I took the two largest response groups and compared them just to see some interesting correlations, and I did choose the agnostics and the Christians with the strongest belief systems, those that ranked highest for connection to their faith and connection to God. And I found some interesting divergence. As far as satisfaction with life, the agnostics were lower by 4 points, which is almost 18%. So that was a pretty big difference. The stronger Christians, those who had a strong connection to God, were definitely higher. This range increases in the self-concept. It's hard to see on the orange. Number 9 for the agnostics and 14 for the Christians. Again, a fairly substantive increase for those who are solid in their belief and feel good about their connection to God and the divine. The same was true for the combined scores, and finally the stress coping wasn't very different, although once again the agnostics had more difficulty coping with stress. 2 points doesn't sound like a lot, but if you remember from the stress chart, we only have it like about a 10-point range. So I consider that at least worth investigating and something to look at in the future. Now, the final thing I'd like to talk about is the difference between self-scoring closeness to God and religion and the scores with the measurements, where they actually took the scale of 10 to 15 questions that really analyzed and had some reverse scoring and some ways of really checking out the depth of their connection to God versus their self-perceived connection. I really believe that a lot of times how we view ourselves and our connection with the divine as compared with our connection to our religiosity doesn't always reflect our reality. It's just our self-concept, and perhaps based on what we hear the world telling us about what it means to be a Christian person, a spiritual person, connection to the divine and connection to church and religiosity. The first chart I'd like to present is the self-scored versus the scale-scored connection to religion. Not a lot of range. As you can see, the religiosity 5 group, which is the highest scores, versus the 1. The scale score is the blue, which really doesn't show up on this screen. But the range was just 39, 37, 35, 33. It followed. So the self-score versus the more objective scale score were nearly identical. They were right about their religiosity. However, even though their religiosity dropped off, for my study participants, their connection to God didn't. To me, this makes one question, how much religiosity do you need for a sense of connection to divine? Can you have your own personal relationship with God or the divine, regardless of your affiliation or lack thereof with a structured religious or spiritual system? Now, for those who self-scored very close to God versus their scale score, which is the more objective measurement, not a lot of difference. It looks like those who felt they were close to God were pretty spot on. And I found that even though their religiosity dropped off, again, the God scores were fairly high. I believe that in spite of all the voices in our world that tell us every path is equally beneficial, it's the self-focused postmodernism, what is right for you, any way is fine, whether you have a belief or even don't have a belief, it's perfectly fine. My study to me revealed that the more important question is not about all paths being equal, but Does the path that you're on bring you into a deeper, richer connection to the divine and have a deeper sense of well-being, concept about yourself, and ability to cope with stress in life based on that connection to a benevolent divine? I'd like to end with this quote by C.S. Lewis, which I find very heartening. He says, "We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased." Thank you so much.